No one really knew what happened that night between Elvis and Ann-Margret, the night that stayed locked away in her memory for decades, sealed behind closed doors until she finally let the truth slip at 82. People thought it was just heartbreak brewing between them, another Hollywood spark destined to burn out. But what happened wasn't a simple romance gone wrong. It was a collapse, a moment that shook everything around them. A night that changed the course of both their lives, when Elvis Presley first crossed paths with Ann-Margret on the set of Viva Las Vegas in 1963. The air between them shifted instantly. The chemistry wasn't subtle. Everyone felt it. The cameras caught traces of it. The crew whispered about it. And audiences sensed something electric pulsing beneath every scene they shared. But what the world didn't see was how fast that electricity turned into something deeper, something neither of them expected. Behind the rehearsals that stretched long after the studio lights went out, behind the late-night talks and the music that kept them awake until dawn, a secret relationship took root. One powerful, enough to threaten the fragile balance of Elvis's carefully managed world. This wasn't some passing Hollywood fling. Ann-Margret would later describe their connection as almost spiritual, as if they were reflections of each other's same instincts, same impulses, same wild, restless spark glowing under the surface. It was a bond too strong to hide, even though they tried. Elvis's friends saw it first. The sudden intensity, the restlessness, the way he hovered protectively near her. He wasn't just enchanted, he was consumed. Ann-Margret wasn't anything like Priscilla, who waited quietly at Graceland, living by the boundaries Elvis set for her. Ann-Margret had fire. She laughed loudly, moved freely, and lived on her own terms. For a man drowning in fame, yet starving for freedom, she was irresistible. But Hollywood never keeps quiet for long. Rumors trickled through studio hallways, then spilled into gossip columns, stolen looks, whispered conversations, nights when the two vanished with no explanation. The more they insisted nothing was happening, the more the press hunted the truth. And then came the headline that detonated everything. Ann-Margret was engaged to Elvis Presley. No one knew if it was a mistake, a stunt, or a slip that should never have escaped her lips. But the damage was instant. Priscilla, devastated and furious, demanded answers. Elvis denied the engagement, but there was something in his denial that didn't quite close the wound. Their truth lived somewhere in the gray, and the world devoured every messy contradiction. Publicly, they were glamorous co-stars with stunning on-screen chemistry. But behind the scenes, they were two souls crashing together, unable to slow down, unable to stop the collision that was coming, and all of it. All the pressure and secrecy and longing funneled into one night. A night Ann-Margret protected for a lifetime. A night she finally spoke about only when the years had softened enough for her to say it out loud. It wasn't the romantic fantasy fans imagined. It wasn't glitter or fairy tale whispers. It was raw. It was painful. And there was a darkness in Elvis that revealed itself only in that moment, something she had shielded for decades. The meltdown that night didn't just shake them. It shattered the illusion the world had built around him. And the story hidden for half a century began. With a single headline that sent their lives spiraling, the claim that Ann-Margret was engaged to Elvis Presley. It was the sort of headline that could have come from anywhere. Bored journalists stirring trouble, a clumsy comment twisted in an interview, or even a studio trick to keep Viva Las Vegas burning in the press. But wherever it came from, the moment the words hit the public, they did damage. Inside Graceland, that single claim Ann-Margret, engaged to Elvis Presley, detonated like a bomb. Priscilla, who had spent years quietly orbiting Elvis's world, finally broke. The calm, patient girl the public imagined vanished. In a fury, she reportedly hurled a vase across the room, shattering it against the wall as she demanded the truth. Was she being cast aside? Had all the years she'd spent waiting, obeying, sacrificing been for nothing? Was Elvis about to choose another woman publicly, boldly, carelessly? Elvis denied the engagement, but the denial had an edge sharp, dangerous, defensive. It wasn't the denial of a man who was innocent. It was the denial of a man cornered. The press feasted on it. Elvis's carefully protected image, clean-cut, controlled, handled with precision by Colonel Tom Parker, suddenly looked vulnerable. The king of rock and roll wasn't supposed to be reckless or emotional or entangled in a scandal. Yet here he was, trapped between two women as the world watched with hungry eyes. Colonel Parker went into full-blown crisis mode, pushing Elvis to distance himself from Ann-Margret in every public statement. But privately, their bond only tightened. And Ann-Margret, without meaning to her, maybe without knowing how dangerous her words could become, kept hinting at their closeness in interviews. Each subtle smile, each vague comment, was enough to send the tabloids into a frenzy. To some, she looked like she was enjoying the fire. To others, she was simply too honest, too unguarded. Suddenly, she wasn't just the radiant co-star. She was the woman who might steal Elvis Presley away for good. Meanwhile, Elvis was unraveling. The weight of his image, his obligations, his loyalty to Priscilla, and his magnetic pull toward Ann-Margret twisted together until he could barely breathe. His moods swung like a pendulum. Friends later described nights filled with ranting about fame, about feeling trapped, about the impossible expectations crushing him from all sides. This wasn't just tangled love anymore. It was a battle for control, pride, identity, and the engagement rumor turned everything into theater. The affair that should have stayed buried became a national obsession. Ann-Margret was painted as the temptress. Priscilla was humiliated. And Elvis was furious. But the real explosion didn't happen in the newspapers. It didn't happen in a studio or on a set. It happened in private. On a night Ann-Margret would carry with her for decades one. She wouldn't even hint at until she was 82 years old. A night that shattered any fantasy of their romance being glamorous or golden, according to the whispered accounts, and fragments of stories passed down over the years. It started with a fight. Elvis had learned something no one knows exactly what. Maybe Priscilla threatened to leave. Maybe Ann-Margret had been spotted with another man. Maybe the scandal simply became too much. Whatever triggered it pushed him past a limit he rarely allowed people to see. He snapped. He paced the room like a man trapped inside his own skin. He shouted. He threw objects. He slammed his fists against the walls. The voice that once melted stadiums shook with a cocktail of anger, fear, and exhaustion. And Ann-Margret, who had seen him at his most charming and vulnerable, suddenly saw a darkness that frightened her. It was the night that marked the beginning of the end. Not just of an affair, but of an illusion. The illusion that Elvis was unbreakable. Ann-Margret had seen Elvis at his brightest, playful, passionate, full of that intoxicating charm the world adored, but nothing prepared her for the darkness that surfaced that night. Some say he accused her of betraying him. Others whisper he threatened to end the relationship if she ever breathed a word of what he was really struggling with. There are even old rumors passed quietly from one insider to another that he broke down in tears, admitting he felt trapped in a life designed for everyone but himself. No one truly knows what was said. But whatever happened, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't glamorous. It was raw, chaotic, unforgettable. For decades, Ann-Margret refused to describe the moment directly. In interviews, she would simply smile, wistful and controlled, calling their connection special and private. That one word, private, was her armor. She guarded Elvis's reputation with fierce loyalty, even when the silence left her exposed. Friends long suspected that her refusal to speak wasn't just about respect. Something about her careful wording hinted at a night far. It's more complicated than a lover's quarrel. Because what happened wasn't just an argument. It was the moment the cracks in Elvis's polished exterior became impossible to ignore. To the world, he was an icon, untouchable, larger than life. But behind that closed door, with only Ann-Margret present, he was deeply human, fragile, overwhelmed, slipping under the weight of his own legend. And she carried the memory of that version of him for the rest of her life. When she finally chose to speak, about it 60 years later, she didn't offer every detail. She didn't need to. Her quiet acknowledgement confirmed what many had whispered for decades. Elvis Presley had shadows he couldn't outrun. Even at the height of his fame, why did Ann-Margret hold on to that secret for so long? Why take the blame, the rumors, the judgment, and never defend herself? The truth, as many have suggested, is layered. In the 1960s, Elvis wasn't just a performer. He was an industry, a brand. A carefully managed empire built by Colonel Tom Parker, who guarded it with iron discipline. Anyone who threatened the illusioning, intentionally or no-risked, being crushed by the machine around him. Ann-Margret knew it. She'd seen how stories disappeared, how narratives were shaped, how Parker controlled the oxygen around Elvis's image. Speaking out could have cost her everything. But it wasn't just fear. There had been love too messy, complicated, impossible love. For all the chaos, she adored him. He let her see a version of himself the public never would, and she felt a responsibility to protect that vulnerable side. Telling the world about his weakest moment would have felt like betrayal. Yet silence came at a price. While she kept her loyalty, the press branded her the temptress, the threat, the woman who almost ruined his marriage. Priscilla was portrayed as the wounded innocent. Elvis escaped the narrative, almost untouched. And Ann-Margret, who said nothing, absorbed the scandal alone. Over time, the secrecy grew heavier. Friends noticed how her voice softened her, darkened when his name came up. She refused biographers, shut down interviewers, and guarded that one night as if it were a fragile artifact. But silence wasn't just loyalty. It was timing. The world wasn't ready to see its idol as a man with flaws. Only now, in her 80s, with her own legacy secure, did she speak enough to let the truth breathe. And even then, she chose her words with caution, out of respect or lingering love for the boy behind the king. The moment she finally cracked open the vault, even slightly, the world pounced. Fans, historians, and old Hollywood watchers scrambled to piece together the puzzle. They dug through interviews, rumors, memoirs, half-forgotten comments from the Memphis Mafia. They found stories of Elvis's temper when he felt cornered, moments when lamps shattered, mirrors cracked, or words were thrown like weapons. Many wondered if Ann-Margret had witnessed something like that firsthand. Some pointed to letters never released. They rumored that might hint at desperation, longing, and emotional storms between them. Others speculated that Priscilla learned more about the meltdown than she ever admitted. And of course, some blamed Colonel Parker, convinced he would have buried any hint of weakness with ruthless efficiency. Even biographers noticed odd gaps, canceled appearances, sudden schedule changes, stretches of unexplained absence around that period. Were they signs of a night that had to be erased? The biggest clue came from Ann-Margret herself. She called it a turning point and said she saw a side of Elvis no one else ever did. That single line sent imagination spiraling. What did she mean? A breakdown? A confession? A moment of rage? A cry for help? Among the most haunting whispers is the rumor never proven, but often repeated that Elvis, overwhelmed by love, guilt, and pressure, feared he might lose control completely. Some who knew him quietly admitted he sometimes said he felt like he couldn't go on. Whatever the truth of that night is, the only person who truly knows carried it for 60 years. And only now has let the world glimpse the shadow. Behind the legend, if there's any truth to the stories whispered over the years, it would explain why Ann-Margret protected that night for so long. Her silence wasn't simply about guarding Elvis's public image. It was about guarding the vulnerable, complicated man hidden beneath the legend. The one she had seen at his most exposed. And now we're left with a puzzle made of half-told memories, hints and fragments, with Ann-Margret herself holding the missing piece. She may never reveal it fully, but even the small glimpse she allowed the world to see has changed how people interpret Elvis forever. Because once you accept that something happened that night, you can't look at him as the flawless king anymore. You see a man coming apart behind the curtain, and a woman who carried the weight of his unraveling for decades. That burden, the silence, the restraint, the loyalty reshaped both of their legacies in ways no one could have predicted. Elvis Presley's image has always been monumental, almost mythic. The king of rock and roll. A cultural earthquake. A phenomenon. But Ann-Margret's late-in-life hint adds a darker contour to that shining story. It reminds people that behind the spotlight, Elvis struggled. He was fragile at times, overwhelmed, human for lifelong fans. That truth isn't easy to swallow, yet it also makes his story more heartbreaking, more intimate, more real, and Margaret's reputation, meanwhile, has shifted in the opposite direction. For years she was unfairly painted as the seductress who nearly tore Elvis from Priscilla. She endured that judgment silently. She never fired back, never defended herself, never revealed what she knew. But now, with her carefully chosen words, she's no longer the villain in the shadows. She appears as someone who showed remarkable loyalty, protecting Elvis at the cost of her own peace and public image. 6 decades of silence, whether driven by love, respect, or fear, is its own kind of sacrifice. It also rewrites their relationship in the public imagination. For so long, it was treated like another Hollywood romance, glamorous, dazzling, short-lived. But the truth seems deeper. Ann-Margret wasn't merely a co-star or a fling. She appears to have been the one person Elvis trusted enough to reveal a side of himself he hid from almost everyone else. That makes her long silence even more striking. She held a secret that could have reshaped his entire legend, and she never used it. The world's reaction has been divided. Some fans feel uneasy, wondering why she waited. Others admire her even more, realizing the depth of her loyalty. And for those who idolized Elvis, the revelation forces a painful question. Can you still worship a legend once you've glimpsed his cracks? Or does seeing his struggle make him more human, and therefore more relatable, more tragic, more beloved? What's undeniable is this. And Margaret's words changed the conversation. Elvis remains the king, but now the crown comes with shadows, hints of vulnerability, of demons he could never fully escape. And Ann-Margret, once cast as the outsider in his story, now stands as the quiet witness, who carried the emotional truth all along. But the most haunting part isn't how their legacies now mirror and oppose each other. It's what her revelation suggests about everything fans thought they understood, that behind the legend, beyond the glitter. There were moments the world was never meant to see, moments only one woman kept alive in her memory for 60 long years. Because if Elvis could hide something like this, if even a moment that raw could stay buried for 60 years, then what else has been kept in the shadows all this time? That's the question fans can't shake. And it leads to a possibility that rattles the very foundation of his legend. For those who grew up idolizing Elvis Presley, Ann-Margret's quiet revelation doesn't just add a new footnote to his history. It shifts the story itself. The king wasn't only the master of charisma and cool control. He may also have been a man who unraveled when no one was watching, a man whose private storms were hidden behind rehearsed smiles and carefully orchestrated appearances. And if that one meltdown truly unfolded the way she implied, then how much of Elvis's life was shaped, polished, or staged to conceal the chaos beneath? And once you let that question settle, once you truly sit with it, an even deeper unease begins to rise. Because legends don't form by accident. They're sculpted, polished, managed. Every photo, every interview, every public appearance Elvis made was shaped to reinforce the myth. A myth millions embraced without ever wondering what truths were quietly tucked out of sight. And Margaret's hint doesn't expose the whole story. It simply reveals that there was a story behind the story, one powerful enough that she protected it for most of her life. And if she kept that one night guarded for so long, this makes you wonder how many moments Elvis himself hid under charisma, showmanship, and the roar of adoring crowds. Maybe it was loneliness masked by fame. Maybe it was pressure disguised as confidence. Maybe it was heartbreak tucked behind a dazzling smile the world mistook for happiness. Whatever it was, it's lingered beneath every performance, every movie, every breathless scream from the audience. And it flickered just once, in front of the one woman who chose to keep that flicker locked away in silence. Now, all these years later, her gentle disclosure doesn't solve the mystery. It deepens it. It opens a door that fans didn't even realize was there. It makes you rethink the music, the interviews, the offhand moments that once seemed harmless, but now feel like they might have been covering something heavier. Because if one private breakdown, one moment of vulnerability, stayed hidden this long, It means the world has only ever known the version of Elvis that was meant to be seen, not the man pacing a room in frustration, not the man wrestling with expectations he never asked for, not the man who sometimes didn't know how to carry the weight of his own crown. The real Elvis. The one Ann-Margret glimpsed might be far more complicated, far more conflicted, far more human than the legend allows, which leaves us with a final, lingering thought. The story of Elvis Presley may not be finished. Not really, because a secret that survived 60 years suggests there are more pieces still buried in lost conversations, in guarded memories, in the silence of those who knew him best. And somewhere in that silence, the truth of the man beneath the myth is still waiting to be found.